Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 341. Welcome back to my co-host, Jordan Tyra. How are we doing, Jordan?
I'm good, thank you very much. Glad to be back.
A little bit warm?
Very warm. I'm in a quite stuffy treatment room with a fan blowing directly onto my back to make sure that we're not melting. But yeah, all good. Wouldn't have it any other way. Love the sun.
Exactly. And then we go from Jordan on the south coast. We come back up to I nearly made a really controversial statement then. The other side of the country, Manchester. Kevin, the Keijzer, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, guys. Enjoying sunny Manchester, so can't complain at the moment.
Top man. Well, thank you very much for coming on, mate. We obviously had a quick chat at our conference. So thank you for coming and for your feedback that we've just been discussing then as well. I've not mentioned your role yet. So can you give us a little bit of a breakdown on your background, but also take us into what you do currently as well?
Yeah, of course. So grew up in the Philippines, and then moved to England at 18 to pursue a career in football or sport. First moved to Ipswich on the south coast, very windy, and did my undergrad, master's, and then most of my PhD there. And then I went to Liverpool John Moores for 6 months to do the last part of my PhD, which was lots of fun. During the master's, undergrad, and PhD during study, I tried to keep myself busy, doing internships, work experience, kids clubs, all sorts, just to pay the bills. And then fell into women's sport or women's football specifically in 2019 with Ipswich Town Women. Was there for 3 years, working across the pathway, helping out with the 21s, leading on some of the younger stuff, and then leading with the first team when they were in tier 4. So very different now. They've just made the championship, which is great news. And just with various experiences over the last 6 years, continue to work in women's sports. So that took me to Man United, where I lead the physical provision performance role for the academy. And I've been here for 2 years and I'm really enjoying it. Well, especially when the weather's like this, you can't complain.
Awesome, mate. I know Jordan probably interested as well in the what academy football in the women's game is looking like currently, because obviously with the provisions now, like you've just mentioned, coaches like yourself in these positions, it'll probably be a good place for us to start on the podcast in terms of what that looks like. Because obviously a few years ago we wouldn't have even had these opportunities, would we? So now, what would you say the academy setting is looking like in the women's game?
Growing, I think it comes with greater demands in terms of audits, and that will always drive the bottom line almost of like this is the minimum standard, and people will never want to be happy with minimum. They'll always want to try and push, and so then it accelerates the growth of the game. Definitely an inclusive environment. We have an active research group within. We call ourselves the Gaffer. Very lovely name, Girls Academy Football Research Group. So that wasn't my genius, by the way. I think that might have been Anthony Turner, who. So we have some great people who work across the pathway at Tottenham, Liverpool, Arsenal, obviously Man City, Man United, Leicester. We've got a real strong group where everyone collaborates. So we've met maybe 4 or 5 times. We're contributing to a book together, which is really exciting, to try and drive the standards and currently where we're at, where we'd like to be. So it's a nice space to be in, to be honest, because it's definitely one that's growing, and you can just chat to people. There's no sort of barriers in terms of, oh, I'm not speaking to you because you work here, or you're a nobody. Like there's nothing like that, which I really, really like.
Brilliant. We could have probably go into that and do a whole podcast on that, but we are going to focus in on flywheel training because it's something that I know you've got a passion and an interest in, and something that you can probably apply a lot of context and information to in the episode. But we spoke before we started recording, Kevin, just about some of like the trends that have happened over the last few years where people have lent into certain types of training. You just made the comment before about people thinking that things are new and then realizing that they're not, and they've been around for years, and we just sort of float between different types of training, different methodologies. We talked about isometrics, Nordics. You spoke about the FMS, things like that. Where do you see that now?
Definitely movement screening again, but movement screening in terms of high risk positions, different actions that are relevant to the game. So probably progressed in terms of the FMS was very much like functional movement where, oh, what's your lunge like? What's this like? That's related to your injury. Now there's some great work being done around cutting, sprinting, change of direction mechanics, landing mechanics. And with that, probably the advent of technology. There were some really good guys from the Netherlands at the conference who were showing some of the incredible stuff that we can start to do with AI in terms of tracking movement and looking at specific, joint angles. And it's incredible because what you used to only be able to do in a lab, you now can do on the pitch. And a lot of the data analysis, the data filtering is done for you. So I've never been privy to a lot of that stuff in terms of how things used to be, because I'm still relatively young. I'm joking. But in terms of definitely where it goes, I think we will start to see a boom in technology, and hopefully we will use that effectively. But I think there'll be a lot of, dead ends and roundabouts that we have to take to get to the right solution to help improve performance and reduce injury risk.
You just made a comment before, well, a bit of a phrase before that I wish we'd have recorded because it was before we hit record. And you said about movement matters. And then you gave some context to that as well. Can you repeat that phrase as you said it, Kevin? Because I thought it was absolutely brilliant.
Oh dear God.
You basically spoke about, we talked about how those trends have gone in like waves. And you said we revert back to the fact that movement matters, but then you added context to it.
Yeah. So essentially what I was trying to say was I feel like back in the day was movement matters, and that's what's gonna, if we move well, we're gonna reduce the likelihood of injury, or we're gonna perform better on match day. We sort of moved away from that after the FMS was debunked, or the advent of GPS allowed us to track a lot more on the pitch. Then we started to look at output. So we started to say, no, high speed running, sprint distance, accelerations, decelerations, all these things are super important. And this is what's going to move the needle in terms of this is what's going to help us win games. These are the things we need to monitor, track. And we're not going to talk about the acute chronic workload ratio, but that's something else as well that came with that. And then I think we're moving now back towards more, yes, all of these things matter, all this data matters, but it's actually how you then perform these movements. So if you do 900, 1,000 meters of high speed running in a game, actually that might not determine whether you're performing well or not performing well. We need to take the context of the game. So we need to look at the tactical and the technical outcomes that you achieve within that distance. And also from an injury perspective or a performance potentially perspective as well, we need to look at how you move. So what do your running mechanics look like when you're working at max speed? What does it look like when you cut? So there's loads of work being done by Tom Dos Santos. We have a PhD student embedded within the women's first team, and she also works across, I believe, across the club, but definitely with the academy as well. She's brilliant. I'll give her a little shout out, Erin Griffiths. And she's done some great work where she'd also previously in her master's looked at the demands in the EPL, I believe, with Burnley. And so there's loads of data now that we have, but it's trying to contextualize that data to the person, their previous injury history, how they move. So it's difficult, but it's definitely doable. And I think that's the direction we're going in.
Brilliant. I thought it was a really good, you summarized things really well. It took us into this topic. So with your practice, Kevin, where does flywheel training fit? And also, if people aren't aware of what flywheel training is, can you give a bit of background to it as well?
Of course, yeah. So flywheel training was researched or developed over 100 years ago by A.V. Hill. So he was one of the first ones to do it. And yeah, we don't know much about it. We're talking about it now as if it's brand new. And so I guess with like a lot of the technology we're talking about, it's something that my PhD is built on. So there's a lot of research, especially in the 1990s, that was developed by Berg and Tesk. So some Swedish, I believe, I don't want to get this wrong, some Swedish researchers, and they were the ones who put the flywheel up in space. So it's currently up in the space station, and that's what it was developed for. And it sort of found its way into rehab clinics, and it was being built by hand by some people. So there was no, like, it's not like it is today with, we have the hundreds of thousands, I wouldn't say hundreds, but thousands of K boxes. It's definitely something that's grown over the last 20, 30 years. And in my practice, I use flywheel training to enhance strength, improve performance, and try to reduce likelihood of injury. Flywheels, I would say, probably are similar to traditional resistance training methods like barbells and dumbbells. The main difference is that they don't use mass, or they don't rely on gravitational forces acting on a mass. So with a barbell, we'd get under it without, sorry, spelling it out too much. We have 60 kilograms and we lift that because there's a resistance from gravity. With flywheels, we don't rely on that. We rely on the spinning inertia, and that generates a resistance. So if we were, for example, to talk about A squat, the user or the athlete would exert force during the concentric phase, so on the way up from a squat, and that would spin the wheel or the disc, depending on the device, and then that essentially would allow you to store energy and then use that during the eccentric phase, so the downward phase of the squat. And we could, in theory, also generate an eccentric overload, but there's probably a few factors we need to consider to achieve that. So a few things we need to modify. But that's basically flywheel training in a very, very short nutshell. It's similar to resistance training in terms of the outcomes, at least with what the literature suggests and how we use it in practice, but it works in a different sort of system.
Awesome. Again, I think that's a really good summary of it. John, have you got anything there?
Yeah, but I think that's a fantastic summary, actually. And anyone who's ever used K-Box or Flywheel Training will know it does feel different from doing traditional training. And I think it is a really effective way. Just to sort of add on to that, the usefulness of it is you get the sort of gains, if you like, of typical resistance training, but without a bar, plates, all the barbells, etc. So at my previous club, Bournemouth, we used to take a K-Box with us to away days. And we would do what we call post-match robustness training. We do a few Nordics and Copenhagen's and other things, as well as some flywheel squats on the K-Box to provide that extra stimulus at the end of the game, typically for the under 18s and under 21s, and brought that to the 16s as well. And the usefulness of the flywheel, allowed us to do that. Otherwise, we'd be bringing, multiple bars, lots of plates. We did bring a few plates, but it wasn't, a full gym setup, which you would typically have if you were in your stationary gym at your club or your training ground. So they do provide, I think, some really nice little windows. And microdosing is definitely a current theme as well. We've been talking about a lot. We spoke about it a lot at the conference with Ben Rosenblatt. Flywheel for me provides a nice little way of getting that sort of stuff into your training. So just Kevin, really, really fantastic summary for that. So anyone who's not familiar with it, I'm pretty sure they'll be a little bit more clued up now. So that work.
I'm keen to dive into both research and your perspectives as well, Kevin, just around a few different areas of utilizing flywheel training as well. And firstly, on jump performance. So how have you found the work that you've done within the gym and then reverting that into performances when you're monitoring jumps?
Mm-hmm. I would definitely say caveat all of this with, to get better at sport, you need to do that sport. So we can supplement that with other things. I'm not saying that flywheel training, like any other method of training, is going to be the solution to you jumping high or you sprinting faster or changing direction more effectively. But definitely there's a lot of value in terms of the type of training that you can do with flywheel training. And there is a lot of evidence now to show both improvements in vertical and horizontal jumping in youth trained athletes, semi-professional and professional athletes. There's a whole host of evidence to suggest that that's the case. That's been systematically sort of analyzed, and that's then been put in. So we've done a few reviews on this, which hopefully can be useful to practitioners, because it highlights essentially what kind of intervention should you do. And so we've seen even one session a week during the competitive season can enhance jump performance between 7 to 10 weeks. So we're talking 2 months to 3 months roughly of an intervention could potentially in season enhance performance. And even with athletes, so volleyball athletes and basketball athletes who are at risk of things like patellar tendinopathies because of the sport they play and the volume of sport they play in season, when flywheel training was applied once per week with them, they were actually able to maintain their vertical jump performance. And so this was throughout the season. This was over a 24-week period. And so actually this evidence is that both flywheel training can both be used as a preparatory tool or a maintenance tool in athletic settings. And that, I think, really speaks to the versatility that we mentioned it can provide, because it can supplement your program. So depending on what you have, what you need, what your athletes require, you can use flywheel training to support them for that. So yeah, I guess it's similar to change of direction, but we can talk about that later.
Yeah, 100%. You said to me before we started recording, like, where's my interest within this topic? And I think one of them, we've not put that to Jordan yet. We can maybe ask him, but mine is definitely around some of the specific angles and joint angles that you can create and some of the positions, and then how you load in them positions. And I know you probably go into it, but your different types of loading that you can do as well. What's been your experience in terms of utilizing maybe some of these specific positions might be a rehab phase. It could just be a little bit more position specific or person specific. What's been your experience around that?
Jordan, do you have anything you want to add on that, or?
Similar, to be fair. Yeah, no, similar. I mean, I've got just through the day to day, a lot of rehab athletes. So no, I'm curious to pick your brain on that one, mate.
Yeah, I mean, the best person to speak to about flywheel training and rehabilitation is Paolo Perna, who's currently doing his PhD with Marco Beato. So he's looking at the use of flywheel training for rehabilitation purposes, and he's a physio at Chelsea. So I'm happy to link you guys if you want. But in terms of my perspectives and my opinions, I think we've only skimmed the top of what we can do with flywheel training. We can very easily hold people in maximal isometric positions at specific joint angles by simply holding the wheel. So the amount of force that you can generate, you can do with 2 fingers, holding the wheel as a coach. And that is literally max effort in optimal positions in terms of essentially where we'd want them with an isometric mid-thigh pull. But we can manipulate that really well. We can oscillate the movement. So we can twist the wheel just slightly to get them to push maximally. And so they transfer between maximal concentric and maximal eccentric and maximal isometric. And we can control that in a very easy way. There's no big plates. And I'm not against that by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an alternative potentially with athletes who are afraid to lift heavy. Because as soon as you see 200 kilos on the bar, if you're very strong, that might be the right stimulus for you. But you're going to go, no, I've got a game this weekend. I can't do that. Whereas with the flywheel, there's no preconceived idea of how heavy that is. You're just working as hard as you can. And if we're smart about how we progress and integrate the training, it's not going to induce the soreness and the DOMs that we associate with eccentric training. If we make good use of the repeated bout effect, I can tell you from experience and the literature as well that it's not going to be as big of a problem as we think it will.
I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it, Jordan, in terms of player buy-in, because the fact that we've got a K box rather than barbells, dumbbells, whatever it's going to be, they're not lifting weights. So yeah, an interesting point.
Definitely. And again, it's bad to lump them in like this, but coaches, as in technical coaches or other staff or other members of sort of the MDT team, everyone will have worked at a club where they'll have a few spiky coaches and be like, why are they doing weights? Like either the age group or the day of the week that you're doing it. Shouldn't be doing that today. Why are we doing that today? You know, the number of times we've all probably had that conversation. And again, it's usually centered around they're holding some dumbbells or they're under a bar or whatever they might be doing, right? So it could be a little solution to that one. You know, actually just get a few, minimal dose effect stuff done, but we're still getting some real work into the legs. But for either players or coaches or MDT staff, it might actually be quite a useful way to sort of bridge that gap.
And just on that note, I just wanted to add in terms of maximal eccentric. So the way we use flywheels typically is we get people to go on them. They either wear a vest or they hold onto a bar and they rip the bar as fast as they can in the concentric phase, and then they decelerate as hard as they can in the eccentric phase. And the transition ideally between those two is minimal. Because we want to try and reduce the loss of energy that we generate between the concentric and the eccentric. So if we see when we pull it up that there's loads of room, that we're losing energy there. So we don't want that to happen unless we're being very specific with our coaching, if we're trying to familiarize the athletes and give them more time between the two phases. But B, also importantly, if we do that, then we're able to quickly transition from concentric to eccentric. And so then that can challenge or benefit from the stretch shortening cycle as well. And what I wanted to touch on was we don't just have to do that. We can get athletes to start at the top of a position and almost like an IKD, we can get them to work at a specific time under tension. So we can get them to do a repetition of 5 seconds where we're rotating the disc at a very specific speed. And that can replicate some of the slower strength work we might want to do or low velocity, high force work. And so I've been doing it for 7 years. So maybe I've been closed in a lab or closed on my own with a flywheel, and I've just stared at it and I've started talking to it and I've gone a bit crazy. But we can get creative with what we do here. Obviously, we need to be careful because as coaches, if we use our fingers and our hands, some people use towels, some people use loads of different things, but you can move with your hands as well, which can aid the training tool. Definitely.
I know with this topic, there's going to be a lot of context to it, and you can expand on this or yeah, go into this as much as you want. But in terms of the specific phases, if we're looking at a concentric focus, an isometric focus, an eccentric focus, what does that look like for you? If we take it a simple squat movement, bilateral squat movement, how would we look at maybe programming the different phases?
Yeah. So if we're trying to focus on concentric strength or velocity, we might want to use lower moments of inertia, so smaller discs or lighter discs. And if we're trying to overload the eccentric phase, we might want to use higher moments of inertia or heavier discs. Now, the two, you're probably going to see a very big difference in terms of exertion, in terms of power outputs or force outputs as well. But essentially, when you train with a flywheel, you are training maximally with the traditional approach. You're training maximally for concentric and eccentric. It's not one or the other. So when we talk about flywheel training, a lot of people mention, oh, eccentric overload training. Yes, absolutely. But with every repetition, you're also doing a maximal concentric action. And in between the two, there is almost no time. So it sits, I think, quite well between potentially traditional resistance training, plyometrics, and also flywheel training, and maybe we can put sprinting somewhere along that continuum. It's difficult to put exercises, in certain places because they have so many different outcomes and outputs. But I would say when you train with flywheel training, it's difficult to isolate concentric only, but you can definitely overload the eccentric and you can definitely overload the isometric. So I hope that answers quite clearly.
It does, and then also tying to what Jordan was talking about, where they would travel with a K box and do some work after games. Would that maybe inform more of your focus? I completely get that there's a concentric and an eccentric part of each lift, but would that be a time when we're focusing a little bit more eccentrically?
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely after the game, depending on, your philosophy and what you want to do. I would say in terms of your typical approach at the moment, in my opinion, it would be good on a -4 or further away from the game. You give them a big strength focus session, and within that you have a flywheel session that involves a larger inertia, more volume, and ideally what we've started to do, actually, we did in 2023, we started to look at the effects of assistance in the concentric phase, because with flywheel training, everything is limited by what you do in the concentric phase. But we know that eccentrically we're stronger than we are concentrically. So we might even be potentially underloading the eccentric phase a little bit. So what we started to do, once again, being closed in a lab, this time with someone else, I said, what would happen if I help you in the concentric phase, similar to what we do with some of our extenuated eccentric loading? What would happen to the outputs? You do exactly the same thing. You try and break hard and within sort of a third of the movement. And what we saw was an incredible increase in their peak power, in the eccentric peak power. So concentrically, obviously, we see an increase because I'm helping them, but eccentrically, we see an increase, and that's only work that they're doing. And so we started to look at, okay, so could this potentially help us understand that we could do this reliably? And we did a study on it, and we found that, yes, you can use concentric phase assistance to increase eccentric phase outputs. And those eccentric phase outputs could be quite beneficial for eccentric strength, injury prevention, improvement in change of direction and sprinting. But there's yet to be real evidence on that. So it's very much anecdotal. It's very much like we've tried to do it. We've seen the benefits of it, but there's no evidence yet to say concentric phase assistance or, overloading the concentric phase will help long term. So that still needs to come. But there's lots of value in doing that, especially if you've got 2 or 3 practitioners after the game and you want to overload the players from an eccentric perspective. Absolutely. Grab them by the belt, or you can stand in front of them and have them use you on the concentric phase and then not have anything eccentrically. And immediately you've overloaded the eccentric phase through that. So loads of ways to get creative with it. The thing to consider is what you do might influence their angles. So if you are in front of them and you're quite far away, practically, they will lean forward more, which will then change their trunk angle, which might affect the outcomes that you might want to get. That is one thing we do see with flywheel training, is that people's trunk angle does change. They do lean forward a little bit because the weight isn't distributed on the shoulders. It's distributed more on the hips, so below the lower back. So just something to consider, but obviously practitioners would do that as well.
And to just pull on a really important point that you mentioned before around familiarization for players as well. we had a few in the gym session at the conference. I think we had a few people finishing sessions with the flywheel, and they were walking a bit funny up the stairs afterwards. And I think it's an important point, isn't it? We're talking about loading after a game, or loading in season. We're not necessarily saying that we should be doing big eccentric loading when you've not really had any exposure to a K box like a few days before a game. That's a really important point, isn't it? I struggle with that word. Familiarizing, is that right?
Familiarization.
Yeah, that's the one. With the movements, it's important, isn't it, Kevin?
Yeah, absolutely. Like with anything else, it needs to be gradual, and there needs to be a good approach to it. I think from the research that we've done, we surveyed over 100 practitioners, and we found that well, here we go. My English.
We're all struggling.
In agreement
The
with
heat. It's the heat.
In agreement with the literature, it's probably 2 to 3 familiarization phases. 2 to 3 familiarization sessions before you can then start to implement flywheel training within a training block. Now, that is the traditional recommendation. What we can also do, and what we should be aware of, is the first session you get someone on a flywheel, just introduce them to it. Get them to do some isometrics. So get the vest on. Oh, this feels weird. I'm going like you have the same conversations. It feels like I'm going off a plane with a parachute. It's like, yes, you are. Da, 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 da. And then you just hold the disc in specific positions, and you get them to push. And hopefully with the isometric, and you can do it submaximal if you're really concerned, you're then getting them comfortable being on the machine. From my perspective, that is something I would do beforehand. Now, obviously, that's not the same stimulus. So within the familiarization phase, from a practical perspective, what I'd recommend is get them on the flywheel device, but use that as a submaximal training tool. So get them to do some isometrics, which probably are not going to have loads of benefit yet, and supplement that with their traditional training. So if they're used to doing back squats and they're comfortable, get the volume of that maybe a little bit lower. So if you usually do 3x5 or 3x6, do 2x4. And then as soon as they finish, so they'll do one set of 4. As soon as they finish, jump onto the flywheel, and then we'll do isometrics. And so then they're seeing that as a little bit of a stimulus together. Then wean them off that as you see them get more comfortable and confident on this, and then start to make the most of that. So it's almost a gradual transition rather than right, okay, we're not doing that anymore. We're doing this. We're going to spend 2-3 sessions, because then what will happen? The players will get frustrated. You might actually suboptimally reduce the amount of load they can tolerate. So in the 2-3, if you do one flywheel training session a week, and we're saying do 2 to 3 familiarization sessions, you might spend 2-3 weeks underloading the players. And so then that can be an issue. But I would say one of the other things that they require as well, flywheel training, is adequate strength levels and a relatively good training age. But for young athletes and people who are rehabbing from injury, these two things are probably even more important, because as soon as you get on it and you feel comfortable and confident, guess what? You're going to start ripping it. You're going to start working really hard. And that can put you in a potentially dangerous position if you're not used to working that hard, because you always underload with the barbell, or because you've had a recent injury.
I think just a quick one, Kevin, on when you're talking about familiarization, how you said about the trunk angle changing in flywheel training. Have you seen any benefit of obviously getting them in the harness, and then just with a light, training bar, or even just a pole, just to have it on their back, just as though they're in a back squat position, so that they're keeping the trunk angle up and then going through the movement? Any value in that?
There can be, definitely. I would say, and this might be controversial to some people, because of the distribution of the load. So there's some really good research, once again, based on the stuff that we need to do in space, where they compare a barbell back squat, a flywheel leg press, and a flywheel back squat, was in terms of the harness. And they saw that actually the amount of load going through the lower back or the upper back was minimal with the flywheel squat. And so in terms of form, actually, if they hunch over in that bottom position, it's not that concerning, because there's no load going through that part of the spine. So it's not a problem necessarily. If anything, actually, it can be conducive, because if they hunch over to then use that momentum that they've generated to then accelerate up, it could be a good method for them to try and get even more work done with the legs. Because on the way down, you can't really use your upper body to decelerate. It's all done with the legs. So I would say in terms of familiarization, the first thing is movement competency. So develop that. Try and target specific mechanical outputs. So see some consistency. So there's encoders on the bottom of flywheels. Some people might not even know that they're there, but if you flip your flywheel over, you can see under like a little black box. And that essentially will allow you to track the outputs that you record or the sessions that you do. And so in familiarization, this can be particularly beneficial alongside your movement competency and what you see as a coach, but also the confidence of the athlete. You can have almost these three pillars. So how confident is the athlete doing it? How competent do you think, excuse me, how competent do you think they are? And how confident are you with the movement? And then what do the mechanical outputs say? Because if it's 1, 2, but then the mechanical outputs are all over the gaff, you got one repetition at 1,000 watts, one repetition at 400, one at 2,000. They're not ready to use that as a training tool yet. And so I think those three pillars are the key components for safe and effective flywheel training.
Brilliant point, that. Really good. I had a couple of questions on what you were bringing up before, Kevin, around familiarization, but also you mentioned about training age as well. So with your experience with the academy now, where does this get introduced? I know it's probably a player-to-player context, but where are you looking to introduce it within the academy?
Definitely to try and develop strength. I'm a firm believer that the academy is just like on the pitch, that we shouldn't pigeonhole them into one specific playing position or tell them they're just really good at one thing. Obviously, they need to develop everything. So when I program for strength training, I tried to co-create programs with them, and I tried to say, what do you want to get out of this? What are your goals? What do you want to do? Do you want to give that a go? Because it's not a scientific intervention anymore. I don't have to be strict in terms of what I program. I will phase them in and out of flywheel training, and we will usually do blocks unless the athlete really enjoys it. And there are probably 5 or 6 in the under 21s, and I would say 3 or 4 in the under 16s who are very confident, very competent, and very keen to use flywheel training in pretty much two times a week, sometimes even 3 times a week. Now, I would like to think that we've educated them enough to understand the benefits and the drawbacks of that kind of training. Because as much as you can get on it, you can also get off it very quickly, feeling very sore. So it doesn't take long to do damage. But I would say building that confidence with the athletes, getting them to understand that we phase it in and phase it out for certain reasons is probably one of the main focuses for us. So we don't use it. I wouldn't say we do preseason, high volume, body weight. Then we do in season, first 3 weeks, we do dumbbells. Then we do barbells. Then we do flywheel. It's not systematic like that. It's very much based on what the athlete feels they can do, what they like, and what we feel they need, especially in this moment of growth or change.
Keen to get both of your thoughts on this, but how early would you potentially introduce flywheel training in terms of ages of, we're talking now specifically female players. Kevin, what would you lean towards with that?
14, 15. It depends on their training age. So if they're used to training at a high intensity, it's a high intensity resistance training tool. You can use it like you would use plyometrics, sprinting, any other form of training, resistance bands. For me, I would feel confident, and I have used it with 14, 15-year-olds. Now, the outputs we get are very different. So the concentric, how much they can produce from a force perspective will limit a lot of the eccentric capacity or the demand that we would expect. If all 3 of us went on it, we would probably have a similar output. But if a 14-year-old girl who can only produce X amount of force goes on it, she will not produce any more force than that eccentrically. So it's all relative to what you're able to do. So I use the flywheel with my dad and my mom's 60 odd. There's a lot of evidence as well to use this in care home facilities because it's always relative to what you do. So from my perspective, that's where I sit on it. But I guess we don't really have evidence-based guidelines yet for that.
Love that. Mum and Dad are getting some squats in on a K box to kick the day off. That's class. Jordan, have you got anything on that? Specifically, like looking at ages of the.
Yeah, I think Kevin's again hitting on the head. It's person specific, isn't it? I mean, we took the flywheels with us to under 18s game, and there was a lot of boys and lads in that squad that you'd be monitoring the post-match robustness sessions, and certain players would go on, you knew they were good, and you were like brilliant, and there'd be certain players who could barely RDL because they were so fresh and limited training age, and you get them on, and you're almost like marking them. You're like man marking them because you're like, right, come on, because you know there's a lot to go that could potentially go wrong here. So it's person specific, isn't it? But we introduced it to the 16s, and we had a few under 15s trying it as well when they were playing up and stuff. And again, it was a case of man marking them. But if you're in an academy setup and you're resistance training from 12s, 13s, 14s, maybe even younger, depending on your club, you will get those players who are ready early doors, and you'll get some who might come in for grassroots quite late, and you're just gonna have to pretty much man mark them if they're going on the K box. But yeah, person specific.
Kevin, just on movement, you mentioned a few exercises that you use. How adventurous have you got with exercises on it?
This is dangerous, this. Because there are people, so obviously at the conference, I think it was a good question. I don't know who asked it. Might have been Kevin Paxton, maybe, about like one of the presentations talked about the importance of movement variability and exposing athletes to loads of different challenges. And there's a part in my head, and I've heard this before, from Jimmy, actually. Jimmy mentioned with flywheel training, it's just a circus. It's just, it's just an act. It's to try and keep people busy. And I think and Jimmy's great, but there are people who have this opinion of flywheel training that it needs to be extremely varied, and the stimulus is always different, and that's what makes it great, because the athlete's constantly adapting to this ever-changing demand, and you're reacting, and so there's more of a sport-specific focus. And we see that a lot in Italy, in Spain, whereas here in England, we're very much on the opposite side of the spectrum, where actually those kinds of forward lunges where you're rotating and catching a ball actually are probably too much of a mixture of different things to really be training one key focus. So by trying to do 2 or 3 things well at once, we probably don't end up doing any of that really well. And so the training outcome becomes a little bit fluffy. Now, I certainly see value in both. The way I apply flywheel training at the moment is bilateral back squats, split squats, lateral squats or V squats, where the athlete accelerates with 2 legs using a harness going up in one direction, and then has to slow down and decelerating predominantly with one side, and then reaccelerates in the opposite direction. And so we've used that with goalkeepers. It's quite nice to overload the glutes. And so, depending on the way you set the machine up, you can get loads of outcomes, especially with the K box. But we need to be very specific as to what we're trying to achieve. There's nothing wrong with doing, multi-directional lunges involving a ball or lights. Like I've used a ball with flywheel training before, but that was more, to be completely honest, to try and get a very minor stimulus and to try and keep the athlete engaged. And so I have no problem saying that, because I feel like the rest of the program gets all of the outcomes we need. And I would say with flywheel training at the moment, the way it's applied here is very different to the way it's applied in Spain or Italy or on the continent.
I think that's a great answer. And also, I think you've made this point numerous times, that I suppose it's asking yourself why you're doing certain things and what outcome are we looking for, and are we actually achieving that? You referenced it before with the squats, didn't you? How we were going to try and introduce flywheels, but we were going to try and get our exposure through a back squat or whatever it was going to be, and then add the flywheel on the end. Because if we just went straight to flywheel, we're going to detrain. I think you mentioned detrain the athletes for that certain period. So I think that's such a good point, and people can't brush past that. And I think there's a middle ground here, isn't there? Because we could be on either side. We could be completely pulling ourselves away from this type of training because we see it as a circus act and all the rest of it. But if we really question every time we're doing something, what is that athlete getting out of this? If it is an engagement thing, then that's the answer, isn't it? I think we've constantly got to ask that question.
Yeah. If we work, for example, with flywheel training, it's very different to traditional resistance training, because with traditional resistance training, if we load the bar up for 6 or 8 reps, only the last couple of reps are going to be truly, well, maybe not even maximal. They might be nearer our maximal, but they will never be maximal. Whereas with flywheel training, every single repetition will be maximal in terms of output, both concentric and eccentrically. And it's only as you fatigue that you start to see that decrement. So whereas we're limited by load with traditional resistance training, so we have to be constantly here. With flywheel training, we start there, and then we decrease. And obviously we can use the same principles we do for velocity-based training or any other auto-regulation methods. We can then cut it off. But I think it provides value. It adds a lot in terms of the program we do, but we need to coach it well, and that's the hard bit. That's what I figured out with the PhD as well. Is there's still loads that we can do here.
Yeah, the coaching is a great point, isn't it, Jordan? Because I think, like with what you mentioned before about shapes and positions that we're trying to get the athletes into, there's got to be an element of coaching to that as well, not just that loading.
Yeah, you've got it's again, it's similar with everything, and I think man or person power is obviously quite an important one as well. And again, I'll reference back to the post-match robustness. If it was me as the sports scientist on the day, and you've got your full squad doing that, and you're just watching the K box, you might have somebody doing a Copenhagen hold the partner over there completely wrong. So sometimes you are a little bit limited by, just can you have a spare pair of hands? But we need to be coaching this properly. Like it's the same with everything, though, isn't it? We don't just go in and go, right, you know what you're doing, crack on. It's got to be done proper. But it's good that I think people definitely off the back of this episode are going to be reaching out to you, Kevin, to try and find out a bit more about this, because we always need to sharpen the tools in our toolbox, but also we need to add tools to the toolbox. And I think flywheel training for a lot of people will be I think a lot of people hopefully will listen to this off the back of your excellent explanations and go, maybe this is a tool to add.
Yeah.
So, we're going to inundate your inbox now, mate. Sorry about that.
No, it's okay. In terms of one practical tip that I've used is choose an athlete or a group, two athletes preferably, because then they can work together, that you trust and you think are very good in the gym. Teach them and then let them crack on. And then get other people, right, when you're resting, time it so that when you're resting from your back squats and they're doing their flywheel squats, have a look at the technique. And then you create an environment where two are working with the flywheel and they're both competent and confident. The other two or three or four are watching them and saying, right, okay, well, how does that feel? And then, okay, I get how it looks. And so then you can then you phase those two out. If you only have one flywheel, you phase those two out and you put them into something else. Or you might give them a complex. So you get them to do flywheel squats going into, after 3 or 5 minutes of rest, some jumps or some potentiated sprints. And then you can get maybe 2 or 4 people on the same flywheel at the same time. But it's about being smart and knowing your athletes. That's the hard part, really, of the job.
Kevin, where do you feel there's an area that needs to be learned more about in terms of flywheel training, or where do you feel like the next development is going to come around flywheel training for football?
I would say that it's used to train and monitor, because it's something like you said there, you use every week after the game. It could potentially, especially with players who are non-starters, it could potentially be another testing session. It could be a feedback mechanism for you to then realize, actually, this is okay, your eccentric strength is improving or your eccentric power is improving. And it's something that allows you to, not that we need more data, but it allows you to systematically implement that. And that can drive intent as well, because the last thing anyone wants to do is train after a game when they've not played. But if you give them the stimulus of, no, this is your test, this is your monitoring, you're working against yourself. If you have especially motivated athletes, it can be really, really useful, in my opinion. So using it within the session potentially as well. So if you say, for example, have specific exercises that you want to use, I use the hex bar all the time now. So I use the output devices and I load it up with 20 kg on each side and then 30 kg on each side. And each week we'll get the athletes to lift that and see how much speed they lift that with. And it becomes a game, but it's also a good way for me to test, actually, do we need to go up in your program? What weights work well for you? We could do the same thing with the flywheel devices, and just test athletes using them throughout the season. So it takes pressure off those big testing points and makes it easier to just monitor.
Love that. John, have you got any other questions or points?
No, I just think that's a brilliant summary and how we can implement it. I mean, Kevin, if other people are going to probably have questions like I alluded to, where can people go to get in touch with you, mate?
You can reach me, Kevin DeKeizer97@gmail.com, or I'm on Twitter as well, albeit not as much recently. With my handle is Kev DeKeizer, I believe, and that's DeKeiJzer.
Awesome, mate. Well, Kevin, thank you very much for coming on. I think you've done a great job there summarizing flywheel training, the how you utilize it as well. But I genuinely feel like you made some really important points in terms of people, whether they are keen to introduce it to their programming or currently use it within their programming. I think there's a hell of a lot that people can take away from what you've mentioned there. So big thank you for coming on.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Jordan, that's another one in the bag, episode 341. That's pretty mental. But we just said when we stopped recording then, it was actually really nice to go into a topic, like one topic, wasn't it? And do a bit of a deep dive into it.
Yeah, 100%. That was a proper, like I said as well, like a proper purist, like S&C podcast, that one. We spend a lot of time talking about, and rightly so, a lot of time talking about coach-athlete relationships, philosophies, all this sort of stuff. And I think that's obviously essential, but sometimes you bulk that out and you need to build around those things with your tools in your toolbox. And that was a proper toolbox episode. So yeah, very, very good. And Kev speaks really, really well. Like some really, really good, some really, really good insights there, and made me think as well about how we can do some bits here at the hub and all that sort of stuff. So no, excellent episode.
I thought the interesting stuff that he mentioned at the end, didn't he, around monitoring, which will be really interesting to see how that sort of factors in. But I think that the point to sort of pull out again from it is what he talked about a lot through the episode in terms of one, thinking about the actual output that we're going for with a certain exercise, not just doing things for the sake of it and because it looks good, all the rest of it. That's a really important point. And also how he mentioned about the introduction, like if you're not using flywheel training at the moment, take that point of that example where he gave around the squat, because he's work done on that and then he's introducing it. I thought that was another really good practical point for people to take away if it's something that is not in their programming at the minute. If it is in the programming at the minute, I also think he made some really good points on how you could maybe think about your programming and structure it throughout a week. So I thought there was loads of really good stuff in there. The obviously context around the player's age as well. Training age, is really important because it just depends on how well they're moving. And obviously I put the question across in terms of the actual age of the player, but training age is obviously much more important when it comes to this sort of stuff. Yeah,
100%. And I like to see what you're saying about this is clearly a very effective training tool. They use it very, very well, utilize it very, very well. But I like the fact that he kept going back to it has to be coached. It has to be coached well. You have to trust your athletes and know that your athletes can do it. I think that's really important because we do get let's be honest, in football clubs, we do get a little bit, lazy is not the right word, but sometimes we go, I know my squad can live. And sometimes you just take your foot off that coaching pedal a little bit. Yeah. And it's like you just facilitate it. You facilitate the gym session or whatever it might be. And sometimes it's important to remember, actually, I am meant to coach this. I like the fact he kept going back to that because that was a really, really valid point.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point as well in terms of coaching. Jordan, thank you for coming on again. I thought it was a really episode. Just say to everyone, just to show our sponsors a bit of love, a bit of support. That's Hytro, The Good Prep, Hawking Dynamics, and also Bridge Athletic. A big thank you to all the sponsors. And we will be back next week with another episode. Thanks, Jordan.
Look to it.